This is Psilo book review number 4, and the book that I'm reviewing today is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This book was 234 pages. It took me about a week to finish. As always, I'm going to score it out of 100 for each category. Starting with characters, I gave this book an 80 out of 100 for the characters. They were pretty interesting characters. The main character, Dorian, definitely changes the most out of all the characters. And we have Basil, who is the artist who actually paints the portrait of Dorian Gray. We have Lord Henry. We have Dorian's fiancée, Sybil. Then we have various lords, monsieurs, servants, as well as Sybil's brother, who is in the Navy. I believe his name was James. And, Dorian starts off as a very innocent character. He's very good looking. You basically describe him as being in the prime of his youth, and he doesn't even realize it. It's the other characters that really let him know what he has, let him know how much they wish they were in their youth, wish they still had their good looks. And over time, the philosophy unfortunately spreads to him. He becomes very vain and loses the innocence that he began with. He falls from grace in a way. You are able to see his soul darken, his soul become full of sin as the story goes on, and you see his portrait change over time. There's, a lot of philosophies that are spoken about in this book, whether it be romanticism versus realism, and it's Lord Henry who really introduces Dorian to most of this, although Basil does help a bit with his portrait and his love for Dorian's beauty. For the author's diction, I gave this a 90 out of 100, mostly because of the detail and the vividness that is described in each chapter. The author's really vivid. He uses a lot of scenery, smells, tastes, a lot of things that portray the time period, let you know that this was set in 1886 in London. The setting, I gave it an 80 out of 100, mostly because it's a similar setting to the first book that I read, as there were gentlemen's clubs in Around the World in 80 Days. I believe it started off in a gentlemen's club, so I did see a lot of similarities in the time period, late 1800s. There were theaters, there were showrooms. As far as the conflict, I gave it an 85 out of 100. There were some surprising moments, especially as Dorian falls from grace, where he does become violent to even what was once his best friend, as well as surprising deaths of characters and surprising resolutions. Most of the time, the resolution is just to continue living, to not worry too much about it. Dorian is convinced to just brush things aside, even though he's badly hurt certain people. And you really see how this plays out, this philosophy of life, of not caring how you affect others, of really only thinking about yourself and enjoying every pleasure that life has to offer. This really leads him into a very carnal existence where he becomes shallow in a way. He becomes very egotistical, and he does not care for others, or he thinks anyone's fault is of their own doing. This is pushed a lot by Lord Henry onto Dorian. I'm not sure if I gave the resolution a score, but that is 80 out of 100. As well as the surprises category was an 80 out of 100, mostly because of what I said before with the surprise deaths, the surprise resolutions to conflict, the parallels to like Romeo and Juliet, or these tragedy moments, where it could have gone one way, but instead it goes terribly wrong, where things are looking good, they're looking romantic, but instead it's all taken away, or it's all ruined in the end. Knowledge, I gave this a 90 out of 100. Like I said, they definitely explore the philosophy at the time of romanticism versus realism and the debates that the different characters have. I would say that Basil is very much a romantic. He's an artist, he doesn't care too much for the pleasures of life. He's more living in his dreams and his visions, his inspiration. Even his love for Dorian is not so surface level as the other people may see. They see his beauty, but Dorian really sees him as an archetype for beauty. He's inspired to paint because of Dorian. Just looking at his face inspires landscapes for him. And I'm not sure if I can find the page, but he really describes him as being, the perfect example of the archetypes, of what inspired art in the beginning. Before I find that page, I do know that on page 90 of the book, they go over some of that philosophy that they spoke of before. And they also allude to plays besides Romeo and Juliet, maybe stories at that time that were popular and being acted out, such as Rosalind or Beatrice or Cordelia. As the character Sybil says, "Before I knew you, acting was the one reality of my life. It was only in the theater that I lived. I thought that it was all true. I was Rosalind in one night and Portia the other. The joy of Beatrice was my joy, and the sorrows of Cordelia were mine also. I believed in everything. The common people who acted with me seemed to be godlike. The painted scenes were my world. I knew nothing but shadows, and I thought them real. You came, oh my beautiful love, and you freed my soul from prison. You taught me what reality really is. Tonight, for the first time in my life, I saw through the hollowness, the sham, the silliness of the empty pageant in which I had always played. Tonight, for the first time, I became conscious that Romeo was hideous and old and painted, that the moonlight in the orchard was false, that the scenery was vulgar, and the words I had to speak were unreal. Were not my words, were not what I wanted to say. So I think this really portrays the character Sybil, her falling from the love for romanticism and the enticement of romanticism, and she's really becoming a realist where, once she felt real love, all the plays faded away from her. She no longer was held by the love within the opera or within the plays, the acting. And now I'm looking for the page where Basil speaks about what Dorian Gray is to him. He tells Lord Henry about him, and Lord Henry very much brushes it off. All right, it took me a moment, but I believe on page 38, Basil describes what Dorian Gray is to him. And it says, from a psychological point of view, how interesting he was. The new manner in art, the fresh mode of looking at life, suggested so strangely by the mere visible presence of one who was unconscious of it all. The silent spirit that dwelled in dim woodland and walked unseen in an open field, suddenly showing herself, dryad-like and not afraid, because in his soul who sought for her, there had been wakened that wonderful vision to which alone are wonderful things revealed. The mere shapes and patterns of things becoming, as it were, refined and gaining a kind of symbolic value, as though they were themselves patterns of some other and more perfect form whose shadow they made real. How strange it all was. He remembered something like it in history. Was it not Plato, that artist in thought, who had first analyzed it? Was it not Buonarroti, who had carved it out in the colored marbles of a sonnet sequence? But in our own century it was strange. Yes, he would try to be Dorian Gray, what, without knowing it, the lad was to the painter who had fashioned the wonderful portrait. He would seek to dominate him, had already indeed half done so. He would make that wonderful spirit his own. There was something fascinating in this son of love and death. I believe at the end he's talking about Harry, him not wanting Harry to taint Dorian Gray, because Dorian very much is his inspiration, where he's getting all his art from. It's basically his muse. As far as symbology goes, I gave it a 95 out of 100, just because, the portrait definitely represents Dorian's soul. There are many moments where when something happens tragically, there is definitely like a foreshadowing of symbol of what was happening before. There are omens throughout the story. I'm not going to find the exact ones, but I believe a bird dies right before one of the character dies, and someone sees, I believe it was Dorian, when he's out hunting, they accidentally shoot someone that was hiding behind the bush, and he sees this death basically as signifying that he will soon die. And you see later on whether or not this is true. Lessons, I gave this a 90 out of 100 because it really shows that the soul is real and the reality of sin upon the body. You see Dorian Gray, although he does not change, you see his portrait change over time. And every sin that he commits, it's very vivid and visually shown across the portrait. With the end, his portrait looking ghoul-like and very death-like, maybe even demonic. Overall enjoyment of this story, I would say I gave it an 80 out of 100. It was enjoyable for its vividness, its quotes, its mention of philosophies, like I said, Plato, not long ago, and this whole idea of exaggerating life in art through romanticism versus the real pains of life that are portrayed in realism, and this debate that was ongoing in the culture of the late 1800s and at the time. People who really want to just enjoy life and the pleasures of life, and those who believe in something more and hold value on this life, thinking that there's something more to it than just the physical. A few more quotes from the beginning of the story. In the preface, it begins with a quote about art itself, and it says, "The artist is the creator of beautiful things. To reveal art and conceal the artist is the art's aim. The critic is he who can translate into another manner or a new material his impression of beautiful things. The highest, as the lowest, form of criticism is a mode of autobiography. Those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things are corrupt without being charming. This is a fault. Those who find beautiful meanings in beautiful things are the cultivated. For these there is hope. They are the elect to whom beautiful things mean only beauty. There is no such thing as moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. The 19th century dislike of realism is the rage of Caliban seeing his own face in a glass. The 19th century dislike of romanticism is the rage of Caliban not seeing his own face in a glass. The moral life of man forms part of the subject matter of the artist, but the morality of art consists in the perfect use of an imperfect medium. No artist desires to prove anything." And one more quote I wanted to read was on page 20. This is when Lord Henry is speaking to Dorian about his own philosophy. Remember, he's very much a realist materialist and believes in enjoying life, all the pleasures of life. And he says, basically he's talking about why there's no such thing as good influence. He says all influence is immoral from the scientific point of view, because to influence a person is to give him one's own soul. He does not think his natural thoughts or burn with his natural passions. His virtues are not real to him. His sins, if there are such thing as sins, are borrowed. He becomes an echo of someone else's music, an actor of a part that has not been written for him. The aim of life is self-development, to realize one's nature perfectly. That is what each of us is here for. People are afraid of themselves nowadays. They have forgotten the highest of all duties, the duty that one owes to oneself. Of course, they are charitable. They feed the hungry and clothe the beggar, but their own souls starve and are naked. Courage has gone out of our race. Perhaps we never really had it. The terror of society, which is the basis of morals, the terror of God, which is the secret of religion, these are the two things that govern us. And yet, I believe that if one man were to live out his life fully and completely, were to give form to every feeling, expression, to every thought, reality, to every dream, I believe that the world would gain such a fresh impulse of joy that we would forget all the maladies of medievalism and return to the Hellenic ideal, to something finer, richer than the Hellenic ideal, it may be. But the bravest man among us is afraid of himself. The mutilation of the savage has its tragic survival in the self-denial that mars our lives. We are punished for our refusals. Every impulse that we strive to strangle broods in the mind and poisons us. The body sins once and has done with its sin, for action is a mode of purification. Nothing remains then but the recollection of a pleasure or the luxury of a regret. The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. Resist it, and your soul grows sick with longing for things it has forbidden to itself, with desire for what its monstrous laws have made monstrous and unlawful. It has been said that the great events of the world take place in the brain. It is the brain and the brain only that the great sins of the world take place. You also, Mr. Gray, you yourself, with your rose-red youth and your rose-white boyhood, you have had passions that have made you afraid, thoughts that have filled you with terror, daydreams and sleeping dreams whose mere memory might stain your cheek with shame. And then Dorian Gray makes him stop because he's really breaking his whole philosophy of life and replacing it with his own. So yeah, like I said, altogether, adding up the scores, this would be an 850 out of 1,000. So once again, for The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, I will give it a Psilo book review score of 850 out of 1,000. And I would recommend this book to others just because of the rich history that it has in it. You know, it gives you a glimpse into this time period, the late 1800s, what life was like, the philosophies that were being debated at the time. It really makes you wonder where you stand, you know, if you're more of a romanticist or more of a realist. And, you know, just like reading Romeo and Juliet, which I haven't read yet because the way it's written is a little tough for me. There are a lot of moments of tragedy, you know, where there is some romance going on, but unfortunately it is cut off early, or it ends early because of the realness of life, you know, the real tragedies of life. And it's enjoyable to see that, you know, this vision of, you know, the real human struggle, and it's portrayed very well for a book that was written, I believe it was written in the 1800s itself. You know, the author was born in 1854 and he passed away in 1900. So this book was, you know, written sometime between that. It was probably written around the time period that it represents. And this was a watermill classic. I did enjoy reading it, and I'll catch you all next time for the next Psilo book review. Thank you.